Let's just take a look at this on a different type of terrain, something a little bit of a different shape. And that we can see something a little bit different. We'll get rid of that sine wave. And our fractal, we're going to need to increase the size of the wavelength. You can see that showing up. And we might need to scale that down just a little bit more. Instead of increasing it all the way up to 1, we'll go down to 0.8. I'm going to decrease our roughness and maybe increase our largest feature. And then we might want to change the scale within and outside of the actual function editor itself. And this is a scale that is based on the overall function, and it will not modify any of the actual nodes, but it's a much easier way to modify some of these surfaces. And I want to get rid of some of those harsh shadows that are being caused by the sun. So we can turn that down to more of an ambient light. And we're going to make our ambient light a little more uniform. Let's just take a look at a render for that and see how this surface is going to look. And now we can see a little bit of a different effect on a different type of terrain. And a lot of it can really depend on the overall shapes of your terrain. But it really looks pretty good. And this is all, of course, based on slope. So I can close that out. And we can always modify these in different ways. Let's go ahead and connect this to the altitude instead of our slope. And now our bump map is based on altitude, and we can set our overall color to that as well. But because we are working with the altitude function, we will need to add new filters to be able to tone that down just a little. So we'll select our link, add a filter, and now you can see we're using the filter that we had before, and what I want to do is just reset that, go back into edit filter, and we can tone that down. And now we'll select that filter, go to our other link, going to altitude, add in a new filter, and it's going to be exactly the same filter that we just had selected. Let's take a look at that. And because of our overall altitude range setting that we have for our filter right now, we're really only seeing the one material, but we can modify that and be able to blend that a little bit better if we wanted to. But let's take a look at another way we can vary this. And what I want to do is just remove these filters that we have where we have everything set to our altitude. And instead of connecting them to altitude, I want to connect them to another fractal node. So I'm going to create a new fractal, and I'm going to use a cellular pattern, Voronoi, which is a pretty neat looking pattern. And now we can disconnect from our altitude and connect that directly to our fractal instead. And now the variation and distribution between these materials is no longer controlled by the altitude or the slope, but rather by this simple fractal we just have set up. And we can change the wavelength and modify this like we would any other fractal in order to get a really neat looking overall effect. Now you can see our surface, which is a really neat looking terrain. And if you wanted to reverse the way that's set up, all you would need to do is change out your inputs. Right now, if we take a look at our blenders, all we really need to do if we want to swap where we have right now the input 1 in these areas and then input 2 in these areas. We could swap those very easily if you wanted to change that out. Same thing if you were working with the slope where you decided you wanted the one material on top rather than on the bottom. We can easily change that out, and all you would need to do is just swap out these different links. And the best way to do that is just select a link, remove it, and then you can swap that over and then reconnect the other one. And then we'd also want to do that for our blender as well on the bump, because we want that to, of course, match up. So we can delete the one link, and then we're going to be reconnecting, and we can change that around. And now we have a little bit more of an opposite effect. And if you needed to, you could always change the node that you're using to distribute these, which would be this new fractal that we have for the Voronoi. Change our gain, and now we can see that showing up a little bit better. And then we can always add a filter and different types of filters to adjust either the individual links or combine them together and connect them to this fractal. So we could add a filter to the one link, and you can see right now we're just using that filter we had before, but we can go through all of the different settings until we pick one we really like. We could use the Gaussian setting, and now we have much more reduced color. We'll just adjust that contrast and reduce our threshold a little. And then instead of connecting this one directly to that fractal, we can connect that to our filter. And that way both of them are now going through this filter up to this fractal, and we just have that one link going to there. And that way all you need to do is just modify the one filter. If you want it to be the same, of course you can always change it, make it a little bit different. We can increase this wavelength if we wanted, maybe stretch it out a little. Reduce this down to 423. And it's always a good idea to add some extra numbers afterwards and not just work with just a 0.7, but if you add, like in this case I added 0.97, we're going to get a little more realistic values and a realistic look, because everything isn't always perfect. And when you're working with completely straightforward numbers where they're all even and uniform, it can give you a little bit of a consistent creation, and that will sometimes cause a little bit of unrealistic effects. And we could decrease that largest value and see something a little bit different. And one of the cool things about a lot of these different noise nodes is we can also go in and edit them a little bit further. And we can see we have an edit option right next to our noise. And in this case, for the Voronoi, we have two different types of modifications and two variables we can set. We have the neighbor mode and the Voronoi profile. And you'll find that most of the patterns and noise settings that we have do have a lot of options we can change. Not all of them do. This one has two. Not all of them will have two to modify. Some will have more. But this one's kind of neat because we have, right now, by default, the closest neighbor mode. But there's also second closest neighbor, third, fourth, first to second neighbors. And this is going to be difficult to tell right now as we're looking at this specific surface, just because of the way we have all of these textures jumbled up. So I can show you this within a noise node, and we'll go ahead and separate that and look at it a little bit differently. But we can change the overall look. Right now it's set to rounded. We could change that to angles, which you should be able to see. It might be a little bit difficult. And there's also spikes, which will stand out more. But if you take a look at the grayscale map that we have, and if I modify our preview options to show 2D planes, we're going to see this a little bit better. And we have all this stretching in here because of the scale changes of our wavelength, but you should be able to see this a little bit better. If we change that to flat, we can see a lot of straight lines, lots of harsh cutoffs. Spikes is a little more varied. And then we have angles. It's just a little bit different. The rounded, which is the default, and then a smooth rounded, which is going to be a little bit more higher contrast around the edges and sort of blend in more, sort of like we had a little bit of a curve filter on it. And then the neighbor mode, we can go through, and it's basically the placement of each of these different noise settings. And you'll be able to see how it removes certain areas of our material. And the higher the amount, the less we're really going to see of that value. And then we could do first and second, and they give us kind of a neat look. Second to third, and then third to fourth. I'm going to change that to second closest neighbor. And we could also set up a turbulence on this as well. First, I'm going to go to this Gaussian filter, and I want to change this to a multiply. And now we can set our multiply value. And you're also noticing this overall color change that we have, really getting into the extremes. So it can be touchy depending on what it is you're working on. Go ahead and reduce that. And even at this value, we can start to see the blue showing up in just that bit of a hue change. But I want to take this fractal and add in another turbulence node. And we're going to use the simple turbulence this time. And we're going to attach our origin, which is our second red connection. And then we can choose our combination mode. And I'm going to set this to max. Increase our amplitude a little. And we can really see that showing up in the preview. And with the XY plane mode on for our preview, or actually just the 2D plane that we have, because the XY is going to show us more of a 3D look and more of a plane that we're looking at from a perspective rather than something we're looking at dead on. It can be a little bit easier to tell your surfaces when you have that 2D plane. And I'm just going to remove that multiply function in there because I really don't think we need it. If we increase that value and kind of take a look, we're still getting too much of a contrast. So just working with the standard fractal, even though we do have a little bit of a color change in there, it's not too bad. And what I could always do is if we take a look at our blender, we can see that blue value showing up, and that's being caused by one of the major inputs, and we could easily correct that, and we can select our line, and then we can see which one it really looks like it's coming from. So we're going to choose input 1 now, which was previously input 2. And we can add in a color correction node since it is green. And since the last one we created was a color map and that's not going to work, we need to change this to color correction. I'm going to use the HLS shift, and we can reconnect these nodes. And now I want to get rid of that blue, so I'm going to decrease our saturation. And in this case, it's actually giving us more of a blue look. And that might be because of our other surface and the way it is being blended together. And we could do the same thing on our other input. And that really looks like it's the one that's causing the majority of our problems. And since we're going to be reducing the saturation, I also want to increase the lume value just to bring out some of the contrast. And then we can change our hue if you wanted it to be a different color. I'm going to set that back to 0. Click OK. And now we can take a look at this on our terrain rather than just in the preview of the function editor. And that's a pretty interesting looking terrain. And now, since we're not based on that slope option, it's just sort of varied between the two different materials throughout the entire terrain. Another thing we could do that's really cool is being a little more specific about where we place that in relation to where the terrain actually is. So what we can do is go into the altitude production for our terrain just by opening up the function editor for that and making sure we don't double click because that will load in previous functions. We just want to right mouse click, go to edit function, take our fractal, and we can just copy this, click OK, OK again, go into the material editor, and I want to adjust our distribution now. Instead of that fractal we had before with the turbulence, first I'll remove our turbulence, select our fractal, and then I can go ahead and just paste that in. And then we're going to reconnect to the pasted in fractal. And it looks like I'm going to have to just take this connection, go to our position, delete that. Now the only problem with this is that we have a different scale set up for our terrain than we do for our material. So it might not show up correctly, and you might need to just change the overall size. So that can sometimes vary because the scale of our current terrain is 0.9 for the material, but the scale in the function editor for our terrain, or in the terrain editor, is 0.1. And we also have different mapping modes set up. So whether or not you need to change the scale to make it match up, it really depends. Sometimes it's easier to work from your terrain functions and then bring them into the material editor before you actually set up your material. But it's a really neat way to sort of even things out and get them to kind of match up, especially with a lot of the different traits that are available with your terrain. And we can see the size is a little bit off, so we might have to modify that, maybe even change the origin point. But we'll take a look at that a little bit later, maybe, where we can copy that over and paste it. One thing I did want to show is those interpolation types for our texture mapping. And what I'm going to need to do is just start out with a new surface for that. So I'm just going to create a new scene and just go up to File, New, use our default. And I'm just going to be using something without any depth to it or curves. So I'm going to load in just a plane. And we're going to be mapping this texture map directly to this plane. And I want to go to the atmosphere editor and change some of our lighting settings. We'll bring our pitch up a little. And we're going to make the scene a little bit brighter. And that way we don't really have that sunset type scene or sunrise. And we're going to go into the material editor, edit our function, and I'm just going to remove all of these current settings, select color, go to add a texture map, make sure it is set to projected texture map, and we're going to load in just one of these image maps. We can see that showing up. I'm going to change this to a flat vertical because we're working with a plane, and that should be more than enough. Change our X to 1.2. And I think I might modify our atmosphere a little bit more. reduce our pitch. And I'm also going to turn off the MIP mapping. So I'm going to go back into our function, turn off MIP mapping. Our interpolation type is currently set to none. And what we just want to do is zoom in to our material. And I'm going to render that out so we can take a look at this surface a little more close up. And we're still not really close to being able to see the pixels fully. You can kind of see them in some of the areas, but we definitely want to move a bit closer so you'd be able to see that a little bit better. Keep in mind these are very high resolution textures, so we do have to get fairly close in order to see the pixels. And as we're rendering it right now, you can see all of the different pixels, and that's what's going to happen if your interpolation type is set to none. And you really have to determine whether or not you will be zooming in this close. And most of that really just depends on the type of and size of image map you're using and the scene you're working on. Let's take a look at some of the different options. We can access this directly through the material editor without having to go into the function editor. And we have our interpolation type right here. We're set to none right now. We can change that to bilinear. We'll go ahead and render that. And now we can see it smoothed everything out and combined our pixels so it doesn't look as pixelated as it was. And depending on how close you're getting, this could actually look fairly decent. Then we have the normalized mode. And in this case, it creates sort of a pattern because of the way it is blending. And we can still see it looks fairly pixelated. So that might not be one of the options you want to use, but it does vary from surface to surface. And then we can take a look at the bicubic function. And that definitely looks a lot better, and at least a lot better than the pixelated version. And this is also very helpful when you're working with your bump maps, because when you're zooming in close to bump maps, it can get very distorted. And let's just go ahead and zoom out a little. And we can take a look at the quality from a little bit further back. And now typically we would see some of the pixels, and you can sort of define where those pixels would have been if you really look at it. But overall, it looks really good. And the chances are you're not going to be moving that close to the texture. We can go ahead and render that from a little bit farther away. And that doesn't look too bad. And let's just go ahead and add in the bump map for that, just by using the color map once again. Connect that to our grayscale output. And if we need to, we can modify that output by using a filter. And this way we're getting our values to be a little bit of a higher contrast. But we can also use other filters as well, instead of just the main one. Combine them together. You can see what the sine wave will do. That'll brighten up our white areas. We could also even that out just a little by increasing the contrast. And we could just move through these different settings until we get it the way we want it. Add in a math node just above all of that. And we could set our vector operation. And once we do that, we can see we're going to lose our connection to our color map node. So technically we wouldn't be able to use some of these different settings. And we could do color to brightness. And let's just take a look at that with our bump map on. And right now it's a very high amount, so we might need to reduce that overall value. And we can see that. And with our higher areas, maybe a little bit too much bump. The lower areas seem to look fine. We can go back into the function for this. And we're going to go down to the bottom, just before our output, add in another filter, and we could use the clamp mode, and we can set up our lower clipping, but mainly we want to adjust, in this case, the upper clipping, because we want it to be a little more uniform and not look so bad. And that might not have done too much, but we can take a look at the final render. And what we've actually done is removed all of the detail in what was the lower areas. So let's go back into our function. And that's because our lower clip we brought up a little bit too high. But there's other settings we have too. We have a smooth clip mode that we'll be able to adjust. And we're just going to go through some of these different settings. And let's see how that looks. And now we're really only pulling out certain areas once again. But one thing I do want to do is just scale this down so we can see more of our surface. And I'm going to go back into our function and we can remove that smooth clip. I'm going to get rid of our sine wave. We could add in a math node, maybe change that to floor, which is really going to smooth out both of the different areas. The fractional part will really even everything out, and we can see that showing up, and along with the grayscale that we can really see. We can do the arc cosine function, just a sine wave, and we can also invert that, so we're working with an opposite effect. Although invert doesn't always completely invert the surface to look maybe the way you wanted it, so sometimes you can just use the filter, go to opposite X, and that will give you something a little bit different and more of an actual inverted value. And I do want to reduce that bump down to 0.5. Let's go ahead and render that. And we can see the surface looks really neat now. The bump turned out really well, and because of the way the image map's set up already, we have the darker areas being a bit lower. Of course, if you wanted that to be equalized, there are those other filters that we can use to sort of do that, but it's really up to you what you want to do with it, and just know that there's a bunch of different options for changing all of that. And of course, if we moved in and take a look at the bump without our interpolation on, it's going to look really bad. So we'll just zoom in and you'll be able to see what that's going to look like and what's going to happen. We can see a lot of pixelation just letting that render, and we can see that all coming in, and it's sort of like a mosaic, and it's not something you'd want to be rendering. Even from far away sometimes you can run into problems without certain modes on, especially for the bump map. The color map isn't usually as big of a problem, but this bump map you can obviously see is quite a large distraction. And sometimes even from farther away you can sort of see that effect showing up in certain areas. So if you need to create a duplicate In this case, what I would do is duplicate all these nodes and just not have the bump plugged in to the main color. And what we could do is create a new texture map and plug the bump into that and just turn an interpolation type on there, but leave the color the same. And if we zoom back in and sort of render that, it does look a lot better. It doesn't look great, but how often are you really going to be this close to a lot of texture maps?